So I've got WinDebug ready to go there. And let me just start with the slides. This is one of our more advanced technical topics. I gave a talk several years ago when I first started doing IPv6 attacks. Kirk and I found a way to crash Windows servers with IPv6 traffic. And all I knew was that you had to give it a flood of packets with router advertisements in them, and you get the blue screen of death. And I demonstrated at a conference, and at that time the only way we knew how to do it involved $600 worth of hardware. So we brought in like suitcases full of junk and set it up, and then turned it on, and poof, it killed the machine. And then people said, why does it work? And I said, I don't understand why it works. I don't know how to find out. And they said, well, why don't you just debug the kernel? And I said, I don't know how to do that. If one of you will show me how to do that, maybe that's the thing to do. For some reason, this kills it. And then one of the guys that hates my guts was online saying, you shouldn't give a talk when you don't know what's happening. I said, dude, this is science, experimental science. All it has to be is true. Like, look, the patient died. Why did that happen? I don't know. But it really happened. That's science. There's also another kind where you actually figure out what's going on, and that would be swell too. And this is how you move there. Kernel debugging, which I now know more than I did at that time, although I'm certainly not an expert by any means, but we can do a little kernel debugging. So, let me see if I can figure out how to get my machine in full screen mode. This.
When they did the double slit experiment, they still don't know how to, they still haven't figured out why it does what it does.
That's true. There is
but they still presented it, right?
Well, yeah, that's the thing, yeah. So there is some way to play the slideshow in full screen, and there used to be keystrokes that worked, shift something. Nope, but I'm losing my mind today.
It's not, it's play.
Somewhere
you have to hit play.
Play. There, it's crooked diagonal line, whatever that is supposed to mean. Okay. What is crooked diagonal line? Which button is that?
Hit play. You want full screen?
Yeah, I could. I wonder, does anybody know what that means? That's not control, it's... Oh, so that, and then cloverleaf and P, all right? Oh, I got it. I've just... There it is. All right, and now I'm happy. Anyway, so, all right, so we talked about Ollie debug and Immunity debugger. Those are user land debuggers. They run like Microsoft Word and Chrome in user land where you run normal programs, and therefore they can debug normal software because they work by using normal interrupts and signals, exceptions, and they don't mess with the kernel. Now, see, if you can put a breakpoint in code, like we did with, say, putty, and then it'll reach that point and stop, and then hand control back to the debugger. Because even though one process is stopped, the machine is not stopped. That's how it works. And that's the whole point of user land. Everything you run is not really the computer. It's just the application on the computer, and even if your application crashes, the computer is still running, which is fine. But if you want to debug the kernel, that's not an option. If you put a breakpoint in the kernel, and it stops, the computer stops. Everything's dead. No keyboard, no mouse, no video. That's not entirely useful. It is a problem. And yet you have to write code in the kernel, and therefore you have to debug it, so there has to be some way to do that, and that's what we're going to talk about here. So, device drivers, this is one of the fundamental structural weaknesses of Windows, which has really been driving Microsoft nuts for decades, is that Microsoft has their software development process, and they try really hard to write good software and make it secure, and then other people put junk in the kernel. And this really, really annoys them. And like around Windows XP, they put up a process where every time your machine would die, it would pop up a box saying, please tell Microsoft about this problem. And they found out that 3/4 of the blue screens of death are caused by non-Microsoft code. And they're getting blamed for it. Boy, Windows is miserable, it keeps dying. And they're like, but that was your crappy driver because you bought a $10 NIC from some company that didn't know what they were doing, and they wrote a rotten driver, you put it in a kernel and it crashes, and then you go blaming us. Well, of course, if you bought a Mac, you couldn't put in a $10 NIC, you can only put official Mac hardware, and that's where Microsoft finally went to with like their Surface. They said, you know, if we sold the hardware too, and you couldn't change it, then people would actually have more of the experience we intended. And it is certainly true that Windows lovers are much happier on the Surface. Those things are really small and powerful. If you love Windows, Windows actually works correctly on that hardware because it's not random junk built by other people and poorly programmed that you're putting in. So the point is, somewhere, your computer has to actually handle the hardware. It has to read the keyboard and the mouse and send data to the video screen and out the network. And so it has to do that from the kernel because nothing is authorized to touch the hardware except kernel mode code. So the device driver has to live in the kernel. And that's the problem. So what happens is the applications don't even see devices. What they see are what Microsoft calls devices, which are software objects representing devices. So your program cannot see the hard drive. What it sees is volume C or D, and that is a software object that points to a kernel driver that will write to the disk. But your program doesn't directly touch the disk. So that's the point. This is a fundamental Microsoft principle. Devices are not hardware. Devices are software. And they are the software representations that you can see, and the driver creates and destroys devices. And device is just sort of like a handle to a driver. It's a software object you can use to send data to kernel code. So if you plug in a USB flash drive,
Question. So one side of the driver has to talk to the hardware, but then the other side talks.
Nope. Yeah, one side just talks to a API call that goes to the kernel.
Okay.
And the other side is visible to your application. So it's just a handle leading to software in the kernel.
Oh, so the kernel still talks to the actual hardware.
Yes.
Got it.
I must see a diagram. You cannot get to the hardware without going through the kernel. This is like, old feudal societies where you're the king, you must wear the fancy robe, and you cannot dirty your hands by doing any real work. You have to tell other people to do the work.
So even drivers don't.
It would be beneath your dignity to actually do the work. You have to make other people do it and bring the answer to you.
So even if I'm a manufacturer of a NIC card, and I write the driver, my driver still doesn't directly talk to my hardware.
No, it does. And that is the problem. If you manufacture hardware, then you have to write a driver, and that driver has to be loaded for people to use your hardware, and that is in the kernel.
Got it. So that's what you need.
That's the problem. This is why Microsoft is annoyed.
Yes.
The kernel is the essential part of the operating system, and yet other people keep putting junk in there. They don't completely own it. Unless you get a Surface Pro. Then Microsoft made all the hardware, Microsoft made all the drivers. Now you have just Microsoft code where it belongs, and therefore it will be up to their specifications of performance.
Got it. So you can add code to the kernel.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, therein lies the problem. And if you couldn't add code to the kernel, a lot of the value of Windows would vanish, because one of the point of Windows is to be the all-purpose operating system for everything, and that means you can have custom hardware and third-party hardware. The whole point is you can have fancy printers, fancy servers, and everything. It all runs on Windows. No matter what it is, Windows will accommodate it at the cost of unknown security problems. Yeah. All right, so when you plug in a USB device, this is where things begin to be nuts. There's plug and play now, every version of Windows. So Microsoft already has the driver for most devices. So they look it up on the list. When you plug it in, there's USB traffic. And by the way, you can see it in Wireshark. It's very interesting. It's plain text traffic. It says, what are you? The device responds with plain text saying, here's what I am. And after it decides that you are something, then it looks to see, have I seen this device before? If I have, I've already loaded the driver. And all I need to do is use the existing driver and create another device object to connect to it. If it's the first time I've ever seen this device, then I need to get the driver, which I might have to go to the internet for that, and load it. And every time from now on when I see this stick or any other stick like it, I'll already have the driver. Which is why in the forensics we talk about, you look at the USB store key, because that lists all the drivers and all the devices that have ever been connected forever. And there's a common problem in Windows. At one time my internet cut out at home and I used my phone for internet for like a month. And I had a USB wireless card on my computer. And if you have a USB wireless card on, I think, Windows 7, there's a known problem that every time you restart, it forgets that it's already loaded that driver and loads it again. So that after about a month, you have like 300 NICs loaded. And it starts slowing down your machine and losing all the memory. And it's like painful to get rid of them. The USB process is quite buggy. But anyway, when it works right, it detects the F drive. When you add the hardware, it loads the driver, which changes the kernel. Then it creates a device object with a letter. And if you were to plug in another drive, it would take the same driver and make a drive another object called G. And those are what you'd use to write to it. So only one copy of the kernel driver is necessary if they both use the same driver, like they're both from the same brand. So remember what happens with DILs. DILs are the dynamic libraries that userland code uses. Well, I think kernel handler uses them too, but the main thing here, if you load a DIL, to draw like dialog boxes or do networking, then when you launch the process, it looks in the header of the table and it says, I need a DIL, so it connects a DIL and imports it into your process memory virtual space using the export table. And it does that by calling DIL main. The first time a DIL is loaded, it calls DIL main, and that prepares it for use by exporting all the function names, which are then imported to each process that runs it. Drivers are similar, but they're in kernel mode, so there's a whole different set of terminology. Drivers have to be loaded in the kernel, so when you plug in a USB stick or printer or something, and it says I need a driver. It then loads it in the kernel and it goes to the driver entry module. Because it's not a DIL, instead of DIL main, you have driver entry, and driver entry prepares callback objects, which are what it uses instead of an export table. And the callback objects look like this. There's a lot of Microsoft documents about them. There's a series of things: create callback, notify callback, and I believe the point here is hardware is slow. So you have asynchronous processing. So I mean, if I write to the disk, I don't just have a command, write byte 1 to the disk, write byte 2 to the disk. I say, send a request to please write this to the disk whenever the disk is ready, which you will handle later whenever you're ready, and I can go on and do something else instead of waiting for that. Because this MS-DOS did not have this. In MS-DOS, you'd load Word, and then you'd hit print, and then you'd go get coffee, because while it's printing, it can't be doing anything else. It could only do one thing. And modern machines, of course, you start it printing, it can print while something else is happening because it uses asynchronous processing, and that's the point here. So the connection between the kernel and user land is generally asynchronous. You've sent requests which are then processed while you can do other things. And so you have this callback object. In Android, they use intents for the similar thing, these requests to a service that might happen later. So DILs load in memory when a process is launched. They use DIL main to start up, and they make an export table. Drivers are in the kernel, and they use the driver entry method to prepare callback functions and callback objects, which are these things that then wait for signals to do things to the hardware. So that's the game here. They must register the address for callback functions, and whenever user-space software requests a service, it will then find the function that it's passing that off to. Yeah?
How do drivers work with Linux kernel?
Drivers work what?
In the Linux
Linux.
kernel.
In what?
With Linux kernel.
With Linux. Oh, they call them kernel extensions, KX, and there are different versions. If you take Slackware, you have to recompile the kernel every time you add anything. And in other versions, they have dynamic kernel extensions, and they load them dynamically like this.
Okay.
Yeah. That's as far as I know. I've played with them a little bit. But the general principles are the same. All the details are, of course, different. LKMs is what they call them in Red Hat, loadable kernel modules, which is what these are, things that can be loaded at runtime, and of course, they are dangerous for functionality and for security. And that's why all the purists say you should just use Slackware, all the rest of this hogwash is just for wimps. Anyway.
But in Linux, you can access the hardware directly, or?
No, the same thing's true. You have user land and kernel land, and you have drivers in between. This is a general thing, because otherwise your crappy user land code would kill the machine dead. So this separation is in the hardware on the motherboard, and supported by every modern OS. It's crucial. Otherwise, you divide by 0 and the computer freezes. This is unacceptable. Yeah. Right, so if you make a read request, you get a file handle to the device, then you call read file. The kernel processes that request, and it calls the callback function to actually do it. So this, from malware, you typically get device I/O control. This is a generic request from user space to get to the driver. You can then pass it data and get data back. And this is how it usually looks. You have a program in user land. It then calls kernel 32, which is not the kernel. It is the user land library to control the kernel. This is the normal Windows API. This is the secret API that you're not supposed to use directly, with the secret high-powered functions that are confusing. You're only supposed to use this, just like you're supposed to use control panel to adjust the desktop. You're not supposed to go in the registry and do that. That's like for madmen. The control panel is the friendly interface into the registry, and this is the friendly interface into the NTDIL. And NTDIL is what actually goes to NTOS kernel, which lives in kernel land, and that calls these drivers that come from whoever made your printer and your NIC, unfortunately, and they then use kernel data structures and send it off to the hardware. So that's how it looks. And there are some kernel mode malware that live entirely in the kernel, but it is more difficult to program and debug the kernel than user land, so most normal software is in user land and most malware is in user land. Only elite people mess around with the kernel. And so that's, of course, the most dangerous stuff, harder to remove, harder to write. It's for your advanced persistent threat actors, not for your amateurs that are just trying to steal credit card numbers, typically. Although they keep getting smarter and smarter. So anyway, so NTOS kernel and hal.dil are libraries often used by malware. And they'll import functions so they can manipulate the kernel. So I got a few Kahoots. I have several rounds of Kahoots tonight. All right, so what does an application interact with? Okay, guess I'm gonna make that a little bit bigger. All right, device objects. which are not hardware, they're software objects in the world of Microsoft. So what code is loaded into a process? Okay, those are DLLs, dynamic link libraries. All right. So when a driver is loaded, what procedure is called first? Okay, driver entry, good. All right, which one of these runs in user mode? Okay, kernel 32 is in user mode. All right, and there are my winners. Let me put my winners down here. I know who those people are. So let's go back to here, and I think it's about time to demonstrate most of this. Okay, so setting up kernel debugging, you are relatively fortunate. Previous generations of students had to suffer greatly. Until recently, the official way to do this was to have a real serial cable and 2 machines with serial ports, which are very hard to find. Same thing happens to Cisco. Cisco also made a bunch of hardware that you must connect to with a serial port. Both Microsoft and Cisco blithely ignoring the fact that serial ports have not existed in 15 years. Old 25-pin serial ports, so you have to get these USB to serial adapters, and there are 2 choices. You can get cheap ones from China for $10 that cause a blue screen of death every few minutes, or you can pay $300 for one that works. And nobody likes these choices. But anyway, yeah.
You know, I'm asking, what $600 of equipment did you could have called in?
Oh, we had to have a real router and a real server sending out real IPv6 traffic in addition to the fake traffic to make it work. That was the reason why Microsoft thought they had patched this problem, and they didn't have it patched, because it only took effect if you had a real IPv6 network and then you added more traffic. If you just sent the flood, it was fine. And I still don't know why, but if I could go debug the kernel, maybe I could find out why. There were strange things about that attack that I discovered. I was doing it with Kirk. It killed the machine. I said, great. He said, let's try it up. So let's try it again. It didn't kill it. Then it didn't kill it. Then it killed it again. I said, what's going on here? He said, it only works when there's the real device connected. I said, oh, that can't be right. It's sending out 1 a second, and here I am sending out thousands. Yeah, try it. The real device made it die. So we plugged all this junk into the conference and showed we can kill Windows. And you really need all this junk to do it for some reason I don't know. Then I learned how to simulate some of it, so I could do it all from one machine. But anyway, that was the secret, was you send a slow packets 1 per second for a while, and then you send a flood. Then it will die. If you just send a flood, it's fine. Anyway, so first you have to enable kernel debugging. The easiest way to do that is to press F8 during boot up and turn on kernel debugging. Another way to do it is to use BCD edit and change it to permanently have kernel debugging on. Now, I'm not doing that much anymore, but I used to have projects that require you to hit the print screen key, and the print screen key has sysrec written on the bottom. What that does is it causes a blue screen of death if kernel debugging is turned on. So this class was not popular with my other students because they go in the lab, do this project, turn on kernel debugging, and everyone else do their homework, and as soon as they hit print screen, blue screen of death. And I didn't understand that. There were various better ways to do that. One is to actually just boot once with F8 and turn on kernel debugging, so next time you reboot, it'll come off again, which I also didn't know. Anyway, so that's the game here. This is what you're supposed to do. Use 2 computers, put WinDebug on it, so this one's being debugged, so now this one is remote controlling it, so it can put a breakpoint and freeze the kernel, examine it, and then run it again, just like you're doing with Ollie debug in userland. And now in the book, they edit boot.ini, because the book is pretty old. Boot.ini was the boot configuration settings for for Windows 95 and Windows 2000 and all that, Windows and Windows XP. And that is very much like the boot options you'll see in Linux if you go to advanced boot options. But Microsoft abandoned that and switched to a new system called BCD Edit for all modern supported versions. And in BCD Edit, you do it with this BCD Edit /debug on. And this will have no great effect on a normal machine unless you hit that sysrec key, in which case you'll be sorry. So you have to install WinDebug, and you can't just download it and install it because Microsoft is cruel. What you have to do is get the Windows SDK, which is like 3 gigabytes of junk, but you don't have to install it all, thank God. When you install it, you can select which features to debug, and you unclear everything except debugging tools. And then it's only 150 megs, which is much more reasonable. And then you have debugging tools. And it's already installed on the Windows 2008 that I gave you, but I'm going to quit using Windows 2008 after this semester. Windows 2008 is not supported anymore, so I've been using 2016, and I set up a 2016. Everything works the same, but I put the instructions here for future reference. This is how you get it working on 2016. The only thing that happened that was confusing is it does not install WinDebug so you can run it from any folder. Somehow it can't set the path, which is pretty rude when Microsoft software can't correctly set the path. But I'm so used to this problem because I use open source software, but the path is never set right, this is my solution, which is very far from a best practice, is to just find where it is and live there. So if you go to this folder, that's where it is. Then put all the software in that one folder and run it from there. That way you can use it. But of course, that way a crash won't prompt the debugger. You really have to find out why it didn't install correctly. But I don't really care. This is the way you can do what we're doing with it. Now, LiveKD is fantastic. LiveKD is Mark Russinovich saving us from all this suffering. Instead, we can do all the kernel debugging in one machine now. Because what LiveKD does is, if you do regedit lets you see the registry and you can make changes. What LiveKD does is just look at the kernel memory and make a copy of it, like a crash dump, and then you can view it in the debugger. So it is you do not have to crash the machine. Now, you cannot put a breakpoint and pause your machine and alter it the way you could with really two machines, because you can't freeze the running kernel, but you can examine the kernel, and that's where most of the value is anyway. So it looks like this. You get WinDebug. When you launch it, it will load some symbols and load some more symbols, and then have an error for some symbols it couldn't find. It's loading the symbols from Microsoft servers, typically. And you have to have symbols for exactly your version of Windows, with the right service pack and everything. So there's a big table of them all, and thankfully Microsoft still has them, but that's an issue. So WinDebug is very twisted. It's like, for that matter, OllyDebug. It's really, as far as I can tell, a command line tool. All you can do is type stuff down here like a chat room, but for some reason they pretend to have a GUI here, which just I would have just made it a command line tool, but they forgot to ask for my advice, which people do far too often. Anyway, so you can do stuff, and I'm going to shrink this down and do it live. Let's play with WinDebug. So here's my machine, and here's the magic solution. And by the way, in Windows 2008, you can run it from any folder. All you have to do is livekd -w after you've installed WinDebug and unzipped livekd. LiveKD is from Mark Russinovich, who is the king of all this stuff. And livekd -w will make an image of the kernel and open it in WinDebug so you can play with it, which is very, very nice. So here it is loading the symbols and getting ready. Then it's got a place here I can type commands. So one thing you can do is bang process, and that will show you the currently running process, which is here, and the currently running process is in fact livekd, which is going to be somewhere, WinDebug. Currently running process is WinDebug, and you can see all the processes with like bang process 0, 0. Maybe I got it wrong. Anyway, I'm not going to, if this is a good point to point out the next thing, there's a thing called help. I think it might be H. Anyway, it's useless anyway, forget it. The one that's any good is .hh. Don't ask me why. .hh opens this one, which is a chum file. This is the old Windows help system from MS-DOS and Windows 95. And in Microsoft, there are two religions. There are people that document things this way, and there are people that document things on TechNet. And this debugger is so old, it's documented here. And although the presentation is a blast from the past, the information is very good. So, for example, if I want to know my help file didn't work, I can find out here by going to index and H, help. There we are. Here it will tell you about help, which is not very exciting, but anyway, you've got various things here you can find out. And so let's take a look. I want to do DX and X. Okay, so let's do LM. Okay, LM lists all the modules. And by the way, there might be some way to make it font bigger. I kind of doubt it, but let me give it a choice, because this is pretty irritating, to see if there are view font options. View font, oh good. Well, that looks too easy. Wonder if it's true. There is no font with that name. Yeah, I thought it was, oh, I got to choose something here. Okay. How about Courier? 10? That's not horrible. Maybe I can do something even better. View font. Maybe I got Arial. I don't got Arial. Got anything sort of readable? Lucida. Lucida is pretty good, and it comes bigger. There we are. Let's see how Lucida 16 bold looks. That's more better. Okay. So, all right. And I can even make that bar bigger, I think. Let's see. Maybe not. I can. All right. Good. So, if I do load kernel modules here, I'll see them all. There they are. And if I scroll up here, you'll see the modules. These are the sections, the things that are running in memory, including drivers. And here's NT. NT is the kernel itself. And notice that all of them have pretty much the same address, with a few exceptions. This 806, that's where the kernel lives. It's not very big. So I can examine NT. I can X NT, and that will show me, let's see what I did wrong. DX address to read. Let's try DX. NT. Nope, I shouldn't have done that. Okay. By the way, it's just as well, this is another thing that happens. If you give it a command that is too difficult, it will freeze up like sometimes forever doing it. Anyway, let's go load all kernel modules, and I'll come back to, or here is an address. If I want to see what is at that address, I should be able to examine it with these commands. DX, okay, DA and DU. Let's try DA at that address. And there we go. This is some of the bytes at that address, MZ dot. It's showing it to me as ASCII. And this is apparently an executable file, which I got it from crashdump.sys, and those are executables, so they start with MZ. So I could also DU and DD. DU is Unicode. That should probably not look any good. Unicode. Yep, that turns into a Chinese character. And DD should give it to me in hex. And then I should be able to do DB to do them both, like good old Wireshark or something, where you see the hex, and over here on the right you should see the ASCII. And this should look pretty familiar. Windows executables always start with MZ, and then they always have this program cannot be run in MS-DOS mode. And this is the thing to realize, just like the programs you launch, all the programs in the kernel are just exact copies of disk files. And you may remember a while ago when we used Process Monitor, and we looked at properties and we compared the strings of the RAM image to the strings of the disk image. And we said if those are different, that's not good. That indicates process hollowing. Somebody has modified the RAM image after it's copied. What you're supposed to have in RAM is just a copy of literal disk files. Anyway, so that's the simplest way to just view the contents of memory. And you can then edit memory with E, A, EU, and ED. I cannot do that with LiveKD. I could only do that if I really had two computers, or simulated two computers with two virtual machines, which I used to do, but it was no fun. You can add things, subtract things. You can do, this will find the value as a pointer, and so on. You can set breakpoints, but not in this version, of course. But if you and you can then, so B point will set a breakpoint, and G will tell it to go again, and you can give it, you can refer to addresses by the name of the process address, and so on. You can use these complicated structures to refer to addresses inside processes. But of course, no breakpoints for what we're doing here, because we are not really debugging the kernel live. We are just viewing the kernel in the debugger so we can see how Windows works. Let me make this as big. All right, and so LM, as I showed you, lists all modules, and you can go to userland to do it. If I do this, for example, LM mdisk, it'll show you the disk driver, and let me demonstrate. This is a good place to see the help function. This thing is very confusing. A few commands are right. It's more confusing than, say, GDB in Linux. It is very easy to get lost and not know what's happening here. So if I do LM, I see a lot of stuff. If I want to find, say, the disk, I tried this earlier, and I tried like floppy disk. Somebody told me there was flop disk. It's just going to complain. You can't do it that way. That's not how you search for something by name. So to find out, you go to good old .8h, and you look for LM up here. This is how you actually figure out how to do everything here. This help is enormously useful, and the commands are very non-obvious. So you really, the thing to do is look them up here and read this stuff. This is the only way to learn how to use the kernel, do and debug. All the tutorials are 200 pages long and make you cry. So LM, A, M, and capital M. This is how you search. List modules matching a pattern. And there's some difference between small m and capital M, which I forget and I don't care. So if you wanted to find something called floppy disk, you use M. And there is no floppy disk because I think my virtual machine doesn't have one. But there is something called disk because it does have a hard disk, and there it is. It's now find the disk. And here's the path to the symbols in that routine. And by the way, when it tells you the module name is disk, the disk file is really disk.sys. It omits the extension here just to be rude. Anyway, so that's where you can see the disk driver. And then you can do DT to look at it. So we can do DDNT, for example. This will show us NT. NT is shorthand for NTOS kernel, the kernel itself. So there's the first several bytes of the kernel. in hex. And if I wanted to see it the other way, I'd do dbnt. And then I get the hex, and over here I'll get the ASCII, which has that usual stuff, because the kernel is an executable like anything else, and it has all the usual structure. It's a PE file. And you can then show only parts of it with ddntl10. That'll show me the first 10 is a hexadecimal number, so it shows me the first 16 32-bit words. Which is very reminiscent of GDB in Linux, which we're using in the exploit development class. All right, so there's the game there. Like I said, .hh is your best friend. That is the help that gets you the really useful help that explains things, and you really have to read this because these commands are baffling otherwise. And when we're using GDB for Linux, we're always dumping out the registers, so I felt motivated to find out how to do that here, and it's R. There's the registers. There should EAX and EBX and some places EIP, which I'm not seeing. Oh, probably I got to scroll to see it.
He's right there on the left-hand
You
side.
see it? Oh yeah, there's EIP. So anyway, you can see it. You can see the registers, which should put you on sort of familiar territory if you've been doing the other classes where we're debugging stuff, because it's really the same hardware as Linux. You know, Windows is just another interface. The assembly is the same. The machine language is the same. Limits of memory are the same. So if you get down to this level, it's the same as Linux. All right. So, are there more cahoots? So, which one sets a breakpoint? EP. There you go. All right. Which one shows memory as ASCII? Okay, display ASCII. Which one shows all kernel drivers? LM shows all loaded modules, including all drivers. All right, and which one changes memory? Okay, E is edit. All right. Yeah, some of these are even relevant. So this one was pretty good. There's an ISP, and these guys claim to be a high security operation, but they put all their stuff in an open Amazon bucket, and in there was a list of who to contact if you find a problem. And they used this list to contact them, and they ignored them for a week. And they went to the government and Department of Homeland Security and everyone, because ISPs are rated as critical national infrastructure. And they found plain text passwords for all kinds of people here. So they had stored plain text passwords. And I thought, you know, this is nice and professional. Here's the document they found all full of plain text passwords. And then they said, they have a nice explanation here about how you should never do this. They say, if you think you need a list of passwords, you are out of your mind. They're more polite than that. They say, you misunderstand how this works. You should never, the document should not have to exist at all. If you somehow think you have to have it, it should be locked in a safe on paper. But you really need to think again. You never need this. You don't need to write down people's passwords anywhere. If you think you do, you haven't understood what's going on. You're supposed to define like a cookie or something that's saved somewhere for this sort of thing. So they're explaining this, and they found their configuration detail and all sorts of good stuff, pictures of their hardware, and you know, it's interesting. This might have some effect on them. It's hard to know what happens in these breaches, but security companies that get humiliated like this, they do often vanish. Other companies, nobody really knows what to say. So this is going to be a big thing in tomorrow in my DNS class, as we mentioned this. I have projects where I use DNS over HTTPS. And as I kind of thought, people are now freaking out. DNS over HTTPS is now approved as an official IETF request for comment. It has been used for a while. It has not yet been built into Windows like a default or anything, but we're headed there, I think, because there are several attempts to encrypt DNS, and they've never went anywhere, like DNS Curve and stuff. This one is the practical one, but now that it's out, people are screaming bloody murder saying you shouldn't do this, like important people like Paul Vixie, who is like really important, from the company that wrote Bind. And he has a pretty good logical argument. He says, wait a minute now, HTTPS involves connecting to the server and getting a certificate. How do you find the server if you don't have DNS? This is like nuts. This has got a chicken and the egg problem. You've got layer 3 that requires layer 7 to resolve layer 3. What are you talking about? And anyway, we'll see what comes of it. But the people said, they said, you technical purists say this is wrong, but you can just take a hike because we waited for 20 years and you clowns never made an encrypted DNS that worked, so we made some garbage that works. The same thing happened with WPA. There was WEP that was unsafe, And the IETF got nothing done for like 12 years. So manufacturers just made their own thing called WPA. They just made it up. It didn't pass any review board. They started selling products and using it for like 6 years. And they're like, you shouldn't use that. And they're like, yeah, your opinion has been noted. People, you didn't give us anything, so we made up our own crap. And of course you don't like it. Well, if you idiots had like been around when we needed it, you could have had your voice. And of course the academics have all these complicated intellectual mathematical reasons why it's not right, but the companies just make something that looks like it works and sell it and make money and say, well, you know, you guys can go argue about the math some other time. The internet is full of that. And this is the Haruhi problem. This is a mathematical problem, and it's pretty simple. If you want to watch like a TV show, and you want to watch the episodes, but you want to watch them in every possible order, how many shows do you have to watch? So if you have 4 episodes, you could watch 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1, 3, 2, 4, and 1, 4, 2, 3. But if you let them break the string, you could write, if you watch 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1, that's got 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's got 2, 3, 4, 3, and 3, 4, 3, 2. You know, if you were allowed to overlap them, how many does it take before you have every possible combination in order? Somewhere in there. This is an unsolved mathematical problem, and on 4chan, somebody solved it, and it's a good solution, and the mathematicians want to cite it, but how do you cite anonymous on 4chan as a source for your mathematical formal finding? This is kind of like Bitcoin, which was invented by someone using the fake name Satoshi Nakamoto, who then retired, vanished, never came back, and like basing huge amounts of important things on it, and they can't even reference the designer or ask him a question or anything. This is, you know, more of the madness of the internet. And this one's pretty good. So the US has decided to execute a cyber operation against the Russians that are attacking our elections. But they don't tell you anything about what they did. And one commenter, I think, got it right, that basically what they did was send them an IM saying, we know who you are, you naughty people, knock it off. I told them that their cover's been blown and they've identified them, so you know. But they're vague about exactly what their offensive cyber operation was. And this one is relevant to this class. I remember I told you VirusTotal. You have to watch using it because it reports everything to the antivirus companies. This is the alternative, like DuckDuckGo, nodistribute.com. We'll scan it with antiviruses and then tell you that they're not reporting it to anybody. But I don't know why you should trust them. I must have a bitter, cynical mind, but you know, how do you know they didn't tell anybody? You can tell that they didn't tell the antivirus companies because it doesn't appear in definition next week, but who did they tell? This is like, there are websites that will make passwords for you. We'll make nice random passwords. And I'm like, thanks a lot. That's what I need. Some server somewhere making my password, doing God knows what with it. I think I'll just make it up myself, or I'll write my own code on my own box. But anyway, here comes a chat comment. Okay. When you upload a file from deep in your machine's folders, are you at risk? That's a good question. If you upload one file, it might be okay as long as it's not a sensitive file, but if you put it like on BitTorrent or something where it's a live share, then of course they can get everywhere. A lot of people share their whole C drive on BitTorrent. But I think, you know, in general, uploading a file, it doesn't matter where you upload it from, just that one file goes. But there have been vulnerabilities in browsers, like Safari a few versions back had a vulnerability where you could upload, you could download a file and it would prompt the user, but if you downloaded 10 files, it wouldn't bother to prompt the user. So you could just load malware on the machine. So there are vulns that come up. I'm not aware of one that affects that right now, though. Anyway, I think I'll mention one more. Drupal has yet another code execution. Drupal-geddon. I have like in my one of my classes, I had people doing the Drupal exploit. I put up an old Drupal server they could exploit, and I guess there's another command injection in Drupal again. Drupal is one of the competitors for WordPress. WordPress, Drupal, and Joomla are the big ones I know, and they all have tons of vulnerabilities. I think of the three, WordPress is actually the best, although I'm sure someone is going to punch me in the face. WordPress, like Microsoft Office, used to be the worst, and they've got humiliated like hell, and they patched all that stuff. And as far as I know, in the last 5 years, they really haven't had a major ridiculous flaw, unless you put on third-party extensions, which they don't audit at all, and some of them are horrible. But if the actual backbone engine is, I think, pretty tight, and Drupal doesn't seem to have really caught up yet. They have a series of scary vulns. Anyway, so let's go back to here and talk more about the kernel. So then there are symbols. You saw this go by before. So symbols are labels. You could refer to literal numerical addresses, but if you load the symbols, you can then refer to Microsoft official symbols for them, which is, of course, easier to understand. So you can then refer to symbol names, module name, bang, symbol name, is an example like NT bang, NT create process will give you the NT-OS kernel, the kernel function, and that's the name of the function. And this construction is equivalent to the numerical number pointing to the start of that function. So that's a lot easier. All right, so let's try a few of these. Let me shrink this down and bring my live machine back. All right, so NT bang create process. So let's unassemble NT bang, NT create process. Okay, and this gives me the first few bytes of the assembly code of that process. And by the way, one thing you can trust Windows to do is to be case insensitive. So this will work too, just the same, which is Linux people, it's not that way, but in Windows, it's that way here, just like everywhere else in Windows. The only place that is not true in Windows is things that actually came from Linux that are running on Windows, which unfortunately there are a few of. But anyway, so that's NT create process. And if you want a different length, you can just put L10 here, and it'll do 10 32-byte groups, which is a bunch of assembly code. And you're seeing just the same old assembly code over there that you'd see in any of the other tools we've used. You can set breakpoints. A BU is a deferred breakpoint, which will take effect when it loads. This is a function that finds the entry point of a module. When I tried to find the entry point of the disk driver, it didn't work here. There's some kind of permission error. I Googled that. You have to somehow move to the right context, load the right process for this to work, which I couldn't figure out how to do. But anyway, that's the shorthand for that. You can search for things. You do not need to give it the full name. You can put asterisks and have part of the name. So if you do this, it'll show you a series of things that create processes. And if you give LN to an address, it will find the closest symbols to that address, which is kind of cool, maybe a little bit like strings, where if you found something you don't know what it is, you could do this to see if there are any Microsoft symbols near there to give you a clue what it is. And DT is very helpful to display type. This is, in my opinion, the most powerful tool I've seen to help you understand things that you don't know about in Windows. So if you look at NT driver object, we can DT NT bang driver object. And it will show us the data structure that does Microsoft drivers. And so this is the C data structure. As you probably know, it's just a whole series of things put in here. So you have integers for type and size, you have a pointer for the device object, you have flags, you have a string called driver name, and so on. This is the data structure that makes a driver. And you can see the assembly code, and you can see how even if Microsoft has some functions they don't want you to use, it wouldn't be too difficult to use this to find out what they do and how to feed in data and use them, and that's what people do. So the hidden API is not all that hidden. It's not like open source code where you can read the source, but it's not as far from it as you might imagine. Not that hard to figure out things, because the kernel is not that big. It's not unthinkable to just find the thing you want and examine it. So there's driver object and there's device object also. Device object just looks like this. Remember, those drivers are the software that can be used many times, and the device is one instance, and this is the structure of a device object, which is similar. So anyway, you can then, if you knew where the beep object was, you could see it here. Otherwise, you can do it with techniques as outlined in the project, and you'll see the code there. And there's a driver init function called when it's loaded, like we've said, and you can see that here. If you show the beep driver, the driver init should be in here someplace. There it is. Driver init is at that address. Long beep driver entry +0, so that's a pointer to it. All right. And like I say, if you have a malicious DIL, you might as well just put everything in the thing that runs immediately upon DIL loading. And if you have a malicious driver, you could just put the malware right in the driver init function. If it's something like a rootkit, you don't actually intend for it to connect to hardware or anything. You're just trying to get it in the kernel so it can steal all the passwords. You just put it all in driver init. Now, Windows symbols are a download from Microsoft that has the addresses of all the name symbols and the names so your debugger can use them. And you can connect them, download them from the internet as you need them, or you can download them as a file and put them locally, which is popular in the old days when internet connections were slower, and it would be good in these days if you want to work in a non-internet connected environment because you're just highly secure or careful. So you want your machine to be not changing while you're measuring it. So you can cache them locally. You can download them manually from a Microsoft website and save them if you want to. All right. And let's see, there should be another Kahoot here called 10C, and so there is. So, which one will set a breakpoint? Okay, that's BU. We'll set a delayed breakpoint, deferred breakpoint. So which one shows you the type information for a structure? Okay, that's DT, shows type. And which one will show all the functions in NTOS kernel? That's XNT, will show you all the kernel functions. There aren't that many, just a few hundred. You know, the kernel is not mind-bogglingly complex, actually. All right, and there's only 3 in that one, but there's another one coming. So let's go back to here and, okay. So in practice, we've talked about this. Let's look at a program that writes 2 files from kernel space. Now, you do not normally do this. Normally, you are in user land, you make a Word document, then you pass it through a driver, and kernel, here's actually a problem. Kernel mode programs are not allowed to call user land. I don't know why, but that's the way it is. So if you want to do it, you have to use NT create file and NT write file. You have to use kernel functions from inside the kernel. You can't call user land functions that then loop back in. So here's what it looks like. This will create a service here to define a service type. And up here it's going to specify the names and such with the create service function. And let me shrink my window down a bit because the blackboard here is cutting off some of the print. There we are. So DW service type is 01, and that is somewhere in this mess. There, that's this one here. So that's a kernel driver to create that service. And here's the thing that pushes EDI and sends the desired access and then calls create file A. So this is going to set it to file writer device. And so this is normal user space code to write a file. It creates a service and then calls it with create file. But once the malware has a handle to device, it can use device IO control down here to send data to the driver. And if you want to do it in kernel mode, you can see every kernel module that loads. Now, when things will load, when you need a device driver, and at other times, various kernel models load, these are the dynamic loads, like the DIL files, and you can see them load. Now, this is not normal. Normally, you only load a kernel when you're adding hardware, like plugging in a USB stick. So if some software is loading a kernel module, that's probably malware. Not necessarily, but likely. So that's just something you might want to do, is monitor kernel loads. And one thing is VMware. VMware keeps loading something called kmixer.sys. That's normal, so that's not malware. Don't quite know what it does, but it's not surprising that VMware needs a kernel module. So drive object will show you driver objects. You can, for example, for file writer, you'll see the address of that. And then you can use DT to see the structure of kernel mode code. Here's NT driver object again. We've seen that. And you can have the file names. So it's going to eventually create this path, DOS devices C secret file.txt. That's a fully qualified object name. If you used to use boot.ini, used to have these, you know, C and D are created during boot up and they don't always point to the same device and everything. They're really kind of nuts. And Microsoft doesn't have like Linux /dev/HDA and HDB. Like they have this system instead. You have / and then the real name of the device here, like physical disk 0 or something. And so that's, there are ways to refer to objects by unique name, but it's kind of goofy looking like that. All right, so applications work with devices, not drivers. And so you look at your user space, you find the device object, and you use dev object to learn more about the device objects, and then dev handles to find the application that uses the handle. So, you know, quite a few steps to tracking things down. But what's more fun is to look at rootkits. We're going to look at the old fashioned kind of rootkits that were used about 10 years ago. So rootkits are things that change the fundamental operation of the kernel so it does something malicious. And therefore, no user land process can really do anything about it or even detect it. And typically what they'll do is, for example, hide part of the hard drive. So you can put something on hard drive. And so now when you do DIR or your antivirus scans every file, the rootkit has altered the functionality of the kernel so it never sees that part of the drive. So part of your machine is beyond your control and out of your sight doing whatever the bad guy wants it to do. That's the kind of thing that happens here. And they work by modifying the kernel, and the most common technique is SSDT hooking, which is a very simple technique, very closely related to what we're doing in the exploit development class when we mess with the global offset table. As in there, we have there's a fundamental principle. If I have a user land process like Microsoft Word, and I want to use a kernel function like print, then the kernel has got a print module, and Microsoft Word could directly call that address and call the print in the kernel. But if they did, then the next time Microsoft patches the kernel and changes that address, Word would quit working. So that's not good. So instead there's a lookup table. So it calls the item in the lookup table, which goes to the function, and if Microsoft updates the kernel, they change the value in the lookup table, so the existing software that's already compiled will find that thing right where it expects to be. And now suppose I want to update Microsoft Word, or my compiler or something, and I don't update the kernel, there's also an indirection on this side. And that's what we're messing with in the malware now in the exploit development class. That's the global offset table, where I call a lookup table, which points to the lookup table in the kernel to get to the function. You go through two indirect steps. But here, the one inside the kernel is called the system service descriptor table. And this is the internal Microsoft list of all the kernel modules and the pointers to them all, and this is where your user land stuff is supposed to go. Go to this table, and it will tell you where to find the kernel routine. So there's only three ways to get into the kernel: syscall, sysenter, and int2e. And the others are old. The one that's preferred now is sysenter. Modern versions of Windows, you're supposed to use sysenter to do this. In Linux, it's int80. But this is the command that enters the kernel, and it's like an interrupt, because remember I said almost everything in the kernel is asynchronous. You don't execute the things one by one. From here you make a request. Please do something, just like the boss. You say, please do this. You don't sit there and watch them do it. You just tell them to do it, and you disconnect from them, and then later they come back and tell you it's done. So here's ntdil.dil, and it goes down at the end and calls sysenter. There you are, 0f34 is sysenter. And what you do is these parameters that you pushed on the stack and set up in the registers are what tells it which syscall you're doing and what you want to do. So here EAX is set to 25 up here, and then you call sysenter, and so that will tell it which function you're executing in the kernel. So these SSDT table entries are here, and what you can just see them, they're in the kernel, you can see them in the debugger, and you can change them. So if I wanted to change the create file entry so it would never overwrite my special files I'm hiding on the box, for example, I could just change this address to point to my code, and my code would lie to you and then pass it off to the real routine, so it works most of the time. And that's how you do it. By just hooking a few kernel functions, I could fool your antivirus, fool the graphical, my computer window, and fool various things. And if I'm a sloppy rootkit writer, I won't really figure them all out. So your rootkit will have defects, which is the way the first rootkits were caught, where you could use one command, you'd actually see 10 files, and the other command would only see 9 files. Then you'd know you got this rootkit. So that's the game there. That's called hooking. And so that's all this says. If you hook NT create file, that won't hide you from directory though, because that's read file or read folder contents, not create file. You have to hook something else. So the simplest, this is actually very easy to detect. You just look at the SSDT, because the SSDT always has the same addresses. They always start with 8. And if you point them somewhere else, they won't start with 8. It sticks out like a sore thumb once you know to look at it. So this is the command that works to show you the SSDT on my Windows Server 2008. The shorter command recommended in the book did not work on Windows Server 2008, but this one did. So let's see if my copy and paste is working, because I don't want to type that. Oh, good. So that hogwash is there, and there is the good old SSDT. So it's pretty long. There are all these, is all the kernel functions that you can get to, and this is the pointer to it. And so as you see, they all start on my machine with 81B. And so if somebody had hooked it, they would show something different. And it would be pretty easy to detect. All right. So there's the table, and here's an example. The marked entry is hooked. He's looked at it just with the other kind of view. Instead of giving the names, it's just lining them up. And that makes it even easier to spot that this one's F7 instead of 80. That's obviously been hooked. Modified in some way that Microsoft would never have modified it. That's not a Microsoft update that did that. That's something else. And so LM will list all open modules. They're all drivers in the kernel. And if you want to find the function,
So that
Yeah.
SSD table gets updated every time you do a Windows update.
Yes,
So
every
wouldn't
time.
Wouldn't that kill the rootkit?
yes, you might imagine, yes, that some Windows updates might possibly kill the rootkit.
Because
Absolutely.
it would overwrite that.
Yes, absolutely. So again, you do quality control. The good rootkits would know that and watch for the update, and also hook the update functions to prevent it. Your sloppier rootkits wouldn't. And that's why I remember this is why one of the old rules of malware infection is your machine doesn't work very well. It crashes all the time. Most malware, most is pretty poorly written and actually causes bugs and problems. As you can see, Microsoft can't even make patches that don't cause a lot of problems. Windows is so complicated in practice because everybody has different hardware and software that it takes a huge, highly trained team to write anything that will actually work reliably. Unless it's very simple. And messing with the kernel is not simple. You're probably going to have a lot of unpleasant side effects. Anyway, so here you're listing the rootkit function, and it shows it's going to call this subroutine and do something else, and then come back and do the normal thing, to call nt-create file. This is the proper way the hook should be. So instead of doing nt-create file, it does a little bit extra, and then calls nt-create file. So most processes on your machine will continue to work fine, just a few of them will lie. So interrupts allow hardware to trigger software events asynchronously. So it calls this to register for a handle, then it specifies an interrupt service routine and an interrupt descriptor table, which are used to connect to interrupts. So you can see the interrupt descriptor table with bang IDT. This shows you things like the keyboard or mouse has been used, so it's going to call an interrupt and say you better check and see if maybe it's time to make a different window come to the front or close a window or something. And all these things are happening. And of course, this would be of good use if you want to make a keylogger. You want to catch these and other things. There's a tool here you can use to load a driver to test it, and there's a lot of good tutorials online of writing your own driver, putting it in the kernel, using the debugger to see it go, which is good stuff for software developers and probably not bad for malware developers either. I didn't give it to you for homework, but it would be fair game. And all right, and then there are changes in the later versions of Windows. The one I mentioned already is ever since Windows Vista, we use bcdedit instead of boot.ini. And the x64 versions, Microsoft, like I said, after they put that XP feature that told them about all the crashes, and they added it up, they said, we got to do something about these stinking drivers. So they put in PatchGuard. And PatchGuard requires you to have, you're not allowed to mess with the SSDT anymore, or the IDT, and you have to sign your code. You have to sign your drivers on 64-bit versions of Windows. And that driver signing is enforced on all of them starting with Vista. Only things signed by a real company will load. So that means you can't take a driver and modify it, add malware to it. You have to get an authentic signature from the real company. And starting about 5 years ago, I've seen plenty of news articles now. Malware authors do, in fact, steal code signing signatures or bribe them from companies and really sign their malware. Not all of it by any means, but there is now signed malware out there. Until recently, it wasn't a common practice. And anyway, they say kernel malware for x64 systems is practically non-existent. However, there are people who run 64-bit systems and they want to run it on crappy old cheap hardware. And so they choose to turn on the no integrity checks. You can turn it on in advanced boot up options and other places. I think there's a regedit hack to do it. So you can run it on crappy hardware and then you're vulnerable, of course. This is like jailbreaking your iPhone. You know, you've gained some power, but you've lost all the protection that was put in there to prevent that. All right. And I'll point you, say a word or two about the project where you play with this after we do the cahoots. All right. So which module is loaded and unloaded by VMs? It's kmixer. All right. What's the normal function? Used to execute kernel code. It is sysenter. The modern way to do it. Okay, what's the object that rootkits alter? At least the older kind of rootkits. Okay, SSDT. And which one of these is not used in Windows 10? Boot.ini, been gone since Vista. All right, what do you need if you use unsigned device drivers on 64-bit Windows? No integrity. There you are. All right. So it is Forrest and Tip. Okay, so face here was Tip. Good. Well, then I've got something resembling real names for people. You have a chance of getting your points. So I just wanted to say a word about the project, because I was very pleased with these, and I think they're why a lot of people are using this class outside of here. They're using it in corporate training and stuff, because this is fun. And I was real pleased. I added a couple things that weren't in your book, because I needed like some malware to analyze, and I found some pretty fun malware to use. So here, here's kernel debugging is here, and SSDT hooking is here. These are the projects that go from this chapter. So here you just get live KD going, which is easy. If you use my virtual machine, it's all ready to go. Otherwise, you got to install it the way I showed you in the slides. Then you can play with a few of these commands like process and all that, and see what the process does, and look at the help, all the stuff we did in the lecture. So this is pretty much normal. And at the bottom, you do some challenges. So here you have to find a function, and here you have to find a module. And students were getting stuck, and the student asked for help, and I couldn't figure it out late at night. So I wrote instructions, so I guide you through it. It's a module, which is different than a driver. And so I set a series of steps there to help you get to it. You can disassemble the beep module. I did this because there were people finding, when I was preparing this a couple of years ago, there was a big foo-for-raw about a local privilege escalation through the Linux beep module. And they put up the beep module, and it was like 20 lines of assembly. And I said, wow, that's like really simple. I wonder how big the Windows one is. The Windows one is pretty small too. And I said, there we go. A nice simple thing to look at. That's really a piece of Windows. This is the thing that goes beep when you hit Control-G if it is 1979 and you have MS-DOS. I don't think it has since then, but it's still in Windows for some ungodly reason. Anyway.
Still there.
It's still there. So I guess there must be some circumstances under which it would beep, but I haven't heard that beep in a decade or more. Yeah.
Oh, nothing.
Anyway, so then there's the rootkit, which is more fun. So SSDT hooking, you can start live KD, you can do this. This command will show you the SSDT. It's another way to do it other than that long command I found. I just find these by Googling and finding somebody telling me I can't figure out what they are. But this one shows you the SSDT again. And I think this is what, the beginning and the end of it or something? Not that I really know. Anyway, this is the address, and this is what's in the address. That's right. That's why this goes up by 4. It's the same thing if you look at the global offset table. So this is at this address, and then 4 bytes on, and 8 bytes on, and 12 bytes on, and this is the thing it points to. So these are the ones that matter, and you see they all start 81C or 81A. It may be different on your machine because the kernel is loaded in a different memory space, but it's always they're the same because the kernel is not very big, and it's all contiguous. So anyway, you can save that into a log with these files, so you get a nice file in Notepad you can search through with Control-F, which is easier than trying to find anything in that long screen. And I found somebody doing this kind of work made this thing called SSDT hook that just hooks a function just so you can see it. So you can install that thing. Thank God you're using a virtual machine. You don't mind messing it up because God only knows what this does to your machine. Somebody had an anti-ransomware product for the Mac that was a kernel module, and I put it on and it killed my Mac dead, and I was like not pleased. So, don't put these on machines you love. Don't mess with the kernel. This is why you use VMs. If you're messing with the kernel, you have a pretty good chance of killing your machine dead. So, in fact, there was a CTF about a year ago, and they had this junk, and they just blithely gave you stuff that would crash the machine and wreck your machine, because they said, well, you didn't use a virtual machine. What kind of fool are you? You're downloading weird crap and running it from a CTF. Ha ha, you should have known better. And I'm like, oh.
Just eliminating the wheat from the chaff.
That's right. I said, well, I assumed you wouldn't do stuff like that to me, but I guess I won't assume that again. Anyway, so after you examine it, you will then see 81, 81, 94, and then it gives you some weird message saying, this looks kind of weird. I can't find the symbols. That doesn't look like a proper NT kernel function. That's pretty obvious to spot. So that's fun. So you can do that one. And then I wanted some more malware, so I just went and found Zone Alarm. Because I heard that this is why Microsoft, so I got such an attitude, because antivirus and security products would hook the kernel this way. Because if you think about antivirus, you load in a floppy, you open it, you double click on the file, and antivirus says, wait, you can't run that file, I have to scan it first. Well, how's it going to do that? It hooks the kernel. It hooks the kernel process called open file and does extra code. And so it's just like malware, and Zone Alarm totally did this like all security products from about 10 years ago. So I just went on like old versions of something and found an old version of Zone Alarm. It hooks all this junk. And Microsoft got an attitude about this. They said, guys, you're messing up the kernel for your product. This is really rude. And they said, we're going to lock the kernel for anything except Microsoft code. And because we look at the iPad and the iPhone, when the iPhone boots up, it takes the kernel and takes a digital signature and goes online to get the public key and verifies that it's official signed software by Apple. And if it isn't, it won't start. It says, your machine is broken, go take it in for repair. Microsoft says, we don't want to do that. Then there'll be no more kernel boot rootkits, no more of that. So they want to do that, and the antivirus companies said they were going to sue for antitrust violation if Microsoft did that. Because they say you're locking us out of our business. So they didn't do it. But anyway, this is the kind of thing that made them want to do it, because this is, of course, really lousy. To mess with the SSDT for your security products. Now when Microsoft patches stuff, they'll break your security product, which will probably kill your machine, and everyone will feel like it's their fault, which I'm sure they feel about these Windows 10 updates too. It probably is when you're running some weird third-party code that it kills your stuff. And Microsoft says, you're blaming us for that, and well, you know, you're the guy that turned on automatic update and ran this stuff down, but yeah.
So how do you, well, I can still boot up my machine when it's not connected to the internet. So
You can, so I guess it must have some way to do that, yeah. It must
basically just gives you a pass or something?
I guess cached credentials. This is what Microsoft does. They have this whole thing called cached credentials. So you can use your machine when the domain controller is offline.
Yeah.
And that turned out to be a huge security flaw. The cached credentials are often not encrypted too well. You can actually steal passwords out of them and stuff. But they must do something like that. I don't quite know how they do it on the Apple. But I know the Microsoft Surface NT supposedly does this. Verifies the signature. So it's a good point, though. I would imagine if you were offline, you might be able to make it run modified code by changing whatever it is that it uses for the authentication. Anyway, so I thought that was good, clean fun. You can observe SSDT hooking, and I guess that's enough for today. I'll just clean up and go to the lab and see if anybody wants help. The only student stuck on this would be helped by the extra tips at the end of that project, so hopefully they should sail through pretty easily, but let me know. And next semester it's all going to be Server 2016. So, or if I'm teaching this next semester, it might be a year before it comes around.
Do you know what you're teaching next semester, actually?
What's that?
Do you know what you're teaching next semester? Right?
I do, but I think there might still be some changes, but it's mostly at the bottom of my webpage, which is at the bottom, I say. There we are. There. That is the plan for next semester.
So, network
But
security
I think it will be finalized at the end of this week. There may be a little change. I think they might have cut network security monitoring. I'm not quite sure. They were talking about cutting it.
So mobile devices, security.
Mobile devices should be coming, and cryptography, I think those are pretty sure.